I was in active labor for 14 hours, and somewhere in the middle of that exhausting, painful process, my parents drove 40 minutes to a lawyer's office and signed the family business I'd spent 11 years building alongside my father over to my brother, a man who hadn't spoken to any of us in nearly 6 years. I found out 3 days after bringing my daughter home from the hospital, still exhausted, still healing, when I tried to log into the company's financial system and discovered my access had already been revoked. My name is Kelly, and this is the story of how I lost, within the span of a single week that should have been the happiest of my entire life, both my daughter's peaceful newborn homecoming and the business I'd spent over a decade of my adult life building alongside my own father. I want to explain what our family business, Larkspur Hardware, actually meant to me, because I think understanding that depth of investment matters to understanding just how devastating this betrayal ultimately became. My father, Walter, started the hardware store 42 years ago, building it, over decades of careful work, from a small, struggling storefront into a genuinely successful regional business with 2 additional locations he'd opened over the years. I began working there part-time during high school, continued through college, and, upon graduating with a business degree specifically intending to eventually help run the family operation, joined full-time 11 years ago, gradually taking on increasing responsibility as my father's health began, in more recent years, to decline. I remember, specifically, the day my father first told me he intended for the business to eventually be mine, a conversation that took place around my 5th year working full-time, both of us standing in the original store location after closing, surrounded by the same shelving units I'd helped stock as a teenager. This place has always felt like it was waiting for someone who actually cared about it the way I do, he told me that evening. I think that person turned out to be you, not your brother, and I want you to know that's not a small thing to me. I carried that conversation with me throughout the following years, understanding it as a genuine, meaningful commitment about my eventual role in the business's future, not simply a passing sentiment. My older brother, Ryan, had a considerably more complicated relationship with both our parents and the family business throughout his adult life. He'd worked at Larkspur Hardware briefly in his early 20s before a series of increasingly serious conflicts with our father, disagreements about business decisions, personal choices our parents disapproved of, a specific falling out roughly 6 years ago involving a substantial loan our parents provided him for a failed business venture of his own, a loan he never repaid, and that precipitated what became a near-total estrangement from the entire family. I want to be clear that Ryan's absence from our family throughout these 6 years wasn't some passive, gradual drifting apart. It was, by every account I understood at the time, a genuine, significant rupture. Ryan blaming our parents for what he characterized as unfair treatment and excessive control throughout his adult life. Our parents deeply hurt by both his unrepaid debt and what they experienced as his ongoing dismissiveness toward the family and the business our father had spent decades building. Throughout those 6 years, Ryan attended no family holidays, made no contact I was ever aware of beyond a handful of terse, occasional texts, and remained, as far as I understood our family's actual dynamics, someone who had essentially removed himself from our shared life entirely. I took over increasing day-to-day management responsibility for Larkspur Hardware over the following years, particularly after my father's heart attack 4 years ago significantly limited his own capacity for the physically demanding, long hours work the business required. I want to describe the specific depth of investment I'd made in this business by the time everything unraveled, not just the practical, daily labor of running 3 retail locations, but genuine strategic decisions I championed and implemented, including a significant modernization of our inventory systems and a successful expansion into online sales that had meaningfully increased the business's overall revenue over the preceding 3 years. My father had, throughout this entire period, repeatedly told me, in both casual conversation and more formal discussions about the business's future, that he intended for me to eventually inherit primary ownership and control of Larkspur Hardware, understanding, as he'd explicitly stated on multiple occasions, that I was the child who had genuinely dedicated myself to building and sustaining what he'd started, unlike Ryan, whose relationship with both the family and the business had deteriorated so significantly over the preceding years. I want to describe the specific circumstances of my pregnancy and the timing that ultimately created the vulnerability my parents apparently exploited, whether deliberately or through some more complicated combination of poor judgment and outside influence I'm still working to fully understand even now. My pregnancy had been generally healthy throughout, though my due date arrived accompanied by the ordinary physical and emotional exhaustion of approaching first-time motherhood, a period during which I'd deliberately begun stepping back somewhat from daily business operations, training our store manager to handle certain responsibilities I would typically have managed myself, understanding I'd need at least several weeks of maternity leave once my daughter arrived. I want to describe the actual day I went into labor, because the specific timing, once I understood everything that happened during those same hours, still produces a kind of disbelieving vertigo whenever I revisit it. I went into labor on a Thursday afternoon, a process that ultimately extended, due to some complications requiring extended monitoring, across nearly 14 exhausting hours before my daughter, Ava, was finally born early Friday morning. I learned, only much later, piecing together the actual timeline through documents and conversations that took considerable effort to fully assemble, that my parents had driven to a lawyer's office that same Thursday evening, while I was still in active labor at the hospital, to formally execute new ownership documents transferring majority control of Larkspur Hardware to Ryan, along with a significantly reduced minority stake designated for me, a fraction of what I'd always understood my eventual ownership position to be. I want to try to describe the specific, disorienting shock of learning this timeline, understanding that while I was experiencing one of the most physically and emotionally significant days of my entire life, bringing my first child into the world, my parents were simultaneously, quietly finalizing a decision that would strip me of the primary ownership position I'd spent 11 years working to earn, transferring it instead to a brother who had been essentially absent from our family for 6 years. I brought Ava home from the hospital 3 days after her birth, still exhausted, still physically recovering, focused entirely, as any new mother would be, on the overwhelming adjustment to caring for a newborn rather than any thought whatsoever about business matters. It was roughly 4 days into this postpartum period, attempting to check in briefly on store operations during what I expected would be a quick, routine login to our financial management system, that I discovered my access credentials no longer worked. I called our store manager, Diane, a long-time, trusted employee who had worked at Larkspur Hardware for nearly 15 years, assuming initially that some technical glitch might explain the access issue. Diane's response, delivered with obvious discomfort and hesitation, revealed the actual situation far more directly than I think she'd originally intended. "Kelly, I probably shouldn't be the one telling you this," she said, her voice carrying genuine distress. "But Ryan came in yesterday with some paperwork saying he's the new majority owner now. He's already started making some changes to how things are run. I assumed you already knew about this, given the timing." I remember sitting on my couch, Ava sleeping soundly beside me in her bassinet, my phone pressed to my ear, feeling the specific physical sensation of the room seeming to tilt slightly around me as Diane's words fully registered. "What kind of changes, Diane? What's he actually done so far?" "He's met with the store managers at all 3 locations," she said, her discomfort clearly deepening as she continued. "He's talked about some staffing adjustments, changes to the ordering process. Nothing's been fully implemented yet, but Kelly, he's been talking like this is all already settled, like you already know and agreed to everything." I want to describe the specific, devastating disorientation of receiving this information while still physically recovering from childbirth, my newborn daughter asleep in a bassinet beside me, trying to process that during the exact hours I'd been laboring to bring her into the world, my parents had apparently been simultaneously working to strip me of the business ownership I'd spent over a decade building. I called my mother immediately, my hands shaking with a combination of postpartum exhaustion and genuine, rising panic. "Mom, Diane just told me Ryan is claiming to be the new majority owner of the store. What is happening?" There was a long, telling silence on my mother's end of that call before she finally responded, her voice carrying an uncomfortable, defensive edge I rarely heard from her. "Your father and I made a difficult decision, Kelly. We felt it was important to bring Ryan back into the family, and giving him a meaningful stake in the business felt like the right way to do that, especially given everything happening with your father's health lately. You did this while I was in labor," I said, my voice breaking despite my effort to remain composed. "You signed away my ownership stake in the business I've spent 11 years building, during the exact hours I was having your granddaughter. How could you possibly think this was the right timing for this decision?" My mother's explanation, delivered over the following exhausting conversation, revealed a family dynamic and decision-making process considerably more complicated than I'd initially understood. According to her account, Ryan had reached out to our parents roughly 3 months earlier, expressing what he characterized as genuine remorse about the preceding 6 years of estrangement, along with a specific request to be reintegrated into the family business given what he described as his own recent personal and professional stabilization. I want to describe learning, over the following weeks, the actual sequence of conversations and decisions that led to this devastating outcome, understanding that my parents had apparently been quietly meeting with Ryan for months, working through a reconciliation process I'd had absolutely no knowledge of. Given how carefully both my parents and Ryan had apparently kept these developing conversations separate from my own awareness throughout my final months of pregnancy. "We didn't want to worry you during your pregnancy," my mother explained, during one of several difficult conversations we had in the weeks following this devastating discovery. "We knew how stressful this reconciliation process might be, and we wanted to wait until after the baby was born to bring you fully into these conversations, once you had more emotional bandwidth to process everything properly." I want to describe the specific, painful irony of this explanation, understanding that my parents' apparent effort to protect me from stress during my pregnancy had resulted in exactly the opposite outcome. A decision made entirely without my knowledge or input, finalized during the exact hours I was in active labor, that fundamentally altered the ownership structure of a business I'd dedicated over a decade of my adult life to building. The specific terms of the new ownership arrangement, once I fully understood them, proved even more devastating than the initial phone call had suggested. Ryan had been granted 60% majority ownership, with my own stake reduced to 25%, and our parents retaining the remaining 15%, a structural change that effectively transferred primary decision-making authority over Larkspur Hardware to a brother who had been entirely absent from the business's daily operations for the preceding 6 years, while simultaneously demoting me from what I'd always understood would be my eventual primary ownership position to a considerably diminished minority stake. I consulted with a business attorney roughly 2 weeks after discovering this situation, still navigating the exhausting demands of newborn care alongside this devastating professional crisis, understanding I needed clear, informed guidance about what legal options, if any, might exist to address what felt like a fundamentally unfair restructuring of a business I'd invested over a decade of genuine, demonstrable labor into building. My attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Ms. Castellano, reviewed the original business structure documents alongside the new ownership paperwork my parents had executed, delivering an assessment that proved both partially reassuring and partially frustrating given the specific legal realities involved. "Your parents, as the original founders and majority owners prior to this restructuring, held clear legal authority to make this ownership transfer," she explained during our initial consultation. "Absent evidence of fraud, coercion, or diminished capacity at the time the documents were signed, this isn't a decision we can easily reverse through legal challenge alone. What we can potentially pursue is documentation of your specific contributions to the business's growth and value over the preceding 11 years, which may support a claim for additional compensation or equity adjustment based on your demonstrable labor and strategic contributions, separate from the pure ownership question." I want to describe the following months, navigating an exhausting, emotionally complicated process of documenting my specific contributions to Larkspur Hardware's growth and success, while simultaneously managing the ordinary demands of caring for a newborn and processing the deeper, more painful question of how my parents could have made such a significant decision during literally the hours I was giving birth to their first grandchild. I want to describe the specific, difficult conversations I eventually had with Ryan directly, roughly 6 weeks after Ava's birth, once I'd stabilized enough physically and emotionally to engage in what became a series of tense negotiations regarding the actual practical structure of our now shared business ownership. "I know the timing looks terrible," Ryan told me, during our first direct conversation since this entire situation unfolded. "I didn't specifically ask Mom and Dad to finalize everything that particular week. That was their decision about timing, not something I orchestrated deliberately to happen while you were in labor." I want to be fair in acknowledging that I ultimately came to believe this specific claim from Ryan, that the precise timing coinciding with my labor and delivery appeared to be more a matter of my parents' own scheduling convenience, and, perhaps, an uncomfortable desire to finalize the decision before they might face pressure to reconsider, rather than any deliberate, calculated cruelty specifically targeting the exact hours of my daughter's birth. This distinction, while providing some limited clarity, didn't meaningfully reduce the practical devastation of what had actually happened to my ownership position in the business. The negotiation process that followed, involving both my attorney and Ryan's own legal representation, took nearly 5 months to fully resolve, ultimately resulting in a restructured ownership agreement that better reflected my actual, demonstrable contributions to the business over the preceding 11 years, an adjustment bringing my ownership stake to 40%, Ryan's reduced to 45%, with our parents' 15% stake remaining unchanged, alongside a formal management agreement establishing my continued primary operational authority over daily business decisions. Understanding that whatever the final ownership percentages, I remained, by any practical measure, the family member with the most direct, ongoing expertise in actually running the business day to day. I want to be honest that this resolution, while representing genuine improvement from the initial, devastating restructuring I discovered while still recovering from childbirth, didn't fully restore either the ownership position I'd always understood would eventually be mine, or the deeper trust in my parents' judgment and consideration that this entire situation had fundamentally damaged. My relationship with my parents remains, even now, over a year removed from Ava's birth, considerably more complicated and guarded than it was before this situation unfolded. I understand, intellectually, their stated desire to reconcile with Ryan after 6 years of painful estrangement, and I don't begrudge them wanting to rebuild that specific relationship. What I continue to struggle with, even with the benefit of considerable time and therapy specifically addressing this situation, is the specific choice they made regarding both the substance and timing of how they pursued that reconciliation, prioritizing Ryan's reintegration in a way that directly, materially harmed the ownership position and professional investment of the child who had, for 11 consistent years, actually shown up for both them and the family business, apparently without adequate consideration for how profoundly that decision would affect me, delivered during literally the most vulnerable, significant hours of my own life. Ryan and I have, somewhat unexpectedly, developed a more functional working relationship than either of us initially anticipated, navigating our shared ownership with a professional structure that, while born from genuinely painful circumstances, has settled into something considerably more collaborative than I would have predicted during those devastating initial weeks. I don't think our relationship carries the same warmth I might have hoped for between siblings, but we've established a working partnership that allows Larkspur Hardware to continue functioning successfully, understanding that whatever complicated feelings remain about how this entire situation unfolded, we both share a genuine investment in the business's continued success. I want to describe one particular moment, roughly 8 months into our restructured working relationship, that suggested some genuine possibility for a more authentic reconciliation between Ryan and me, separate from the underlying business dispute. We were both at the original store location late one evening, finishing up an inventory review, and Ryan mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd been thinking about how differently things might have unfolded if he'd simply reached back out to me directly, years earlier, rather than allowing the estrangement to persist as long as it did. I think I convinced myself, for a long time, that staying away was easier than actually dealing with everything that went wrong, he said. I don't think that was ever really true. I think it was just easier to avoid, and I'm sorry that avoidance eventually turned into something that hurt you specifically, in a way I don't think either of us actually wanted. Ava is now 14 months old, a happy, thriving toddler with no awareness, at her current age, of the professional crisis that shadowed the earliest days of her life. I think, often, about the specific cruelty of timing embedded in this entire situation, understanding that the exact hours I should have been able to focus entirely on the extraordinary experience of becoming a mother for the first time were instead permanently, irrevocably connected to one of the most significant professional betrayals of my adult life. If you've ever discovered that a significant decision affecting your professional or financial security had been made during a moment of profound personal vulnerability, without your knowledge or input, I want to hear how you navigated both the practical and emotional complexity of addressing it afterward. I used to believe that my 11 years of consistent, demonstrable dedication to our family business represented an unshakable foundation for my eventual ownership position, immune to sudden, unexpected restructuring regardless of whatever family reconciliation processes might be unfolding elsewhere. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that even the most earned, demonstrable professional investment can be suddenly, significantly altered by family decisions made entirely outside your awareness, during exactly the hours you're least equipped to notice or respond to what's actually happening.